I'm here today to see Judie. Judie's a client of mine. She came to see me a couple of years ago on behalf of her mum, Sheila, to tell me about Sheila's challenge and see if that was something that I might be able to solve for her using DNA.
Hello, Judy. How are you? Are you well?
Judie, perhaps you might tell us a little bit about Sheila's story.
Okay, sure. So I'm telling the story on behalf of Sheila because sadly she died in 2020. But from being a young woman, she'd always wanted to know who her father was. As she grew up in Manchester, and as a small child, she was told that her father had died before she was born. She went to university in London to study mathematics, and at that point, there was a possibility she might compete in a hockey tournament abroad, so she needed a passport. So when she asked her mother, my grandmother, for the documentation, the birth certificate, etc., she was then told that this story about the father dying before she was born was completely made up, and that she wasn't going to be told who her father was. So ever since then, and I think she was about 19 or 20 then, she had a burning desire to know who her father was. It was a real, I would say, a visceral need for her to fill that gap. In conversation, I found out that Louise did this, and she was fairly confident she could find out who the father was. So we purchased a DNA kit, and she provided a saliva sample, posted it off, and in due course, of course, the results came back, which I then handed over to Louise, and she did various techniques on them, and basically came back saying it was one of 3 brothers. Now, to tell a little bit more about my mother's history, she was an only child, and her mother had a sister who was married to a very wealthy man with a business in the Philippines. So this sister and her family, originally 4 boys, of whom 1 died young, but the 3 remaining sons lived in the Philippines. Of course, for well-off English boys of that era, it was out of the question to be educated abroad. So when they were 8, they were all brought across to England and enrolled in a minor public school somewhere in Nottinghamshire. Even the long summer holidays wasn't enough time for them to get back to the Philippines to be with their family because it was a 6-week passage. So all 3 boys, during all the school holidays, spent time with their aunt, who was my great-grandmother, so the sister of their mother. So basically, my granny and her brother and sister and these 3 first cousins grew up together. The 4 boys all went to school together. The 2 girls went to a local day school. And they must have just been really grown up like siblings. So when Louise told me the name, I remember the surname because I knew the eldest of these 3 brothers until he died in his 70s. I remember him when I was a little girl coming round and visiting us. He lived in South Africa at the time. I was absolutely amazed to learn that one of these 3 sons was the father of my mother. So basically it was a relationship had happened between these 2 first cousins. She was very happy at home. She was a very happy child and did well at school. But always had this burning need to know who her father was. And realistically, the DNA doesn't say which brother it is, but the youngest would only have been 14, so we've ruled him out. Of the other 2, one, the eldest, was repeatedly generous to her, wedding gifts, left money in a will, all sorts of things like that, and kept in touch with her, and in fact with myself and my sisters, the rest of his life. So we know that Edward was the father, although the DNA hasn't proven that. When she first found out, it was the most enormous shock, and she and I were both shaking. But as she acclimatised to the idea and got used to it. I think, well, I know she came to think that it was a good thing that her father was actually a man she'd known until he died, and in fact he loved her. And I can remember him when we were running around the garden as little girls, watching us, and he obviously loved us, and it must have been quite hard for him not to be able to acknowledge these three granddaughters as his. But she was immensely relieved and happy to find out, because she felt this hole she'd felt all her life had been filled in. She described it as something she'd always wanted to know, and her mother refused to discuss it. I don't think she'd ever expected to have to tell her daughter, and they hadn't thought through the consequences of the lack of correct paperwork at the time of the birth. And she hadn't thought through what might happen later and the consequences it would potentially have. And of course, having a baby in 1932 out of wedlock would have been seen as a very terrible thing. What's interesting in Sheila's baby book, which I found after she died actually, there's goodwill messages from Edward's parents and his two other brothers, but Edward is absent. And in practice, he was just down from Cambridge University, and he was immediately sent back to the Philippines to start running the family business, which had always been his, right almost as the eldest son. But he was very quickly sent back to the Philippines to get him out of the way of any further involvement. And it was only later, when Sheila was growing up, that I suppose it was quite respectable. Your first cousin visiting to see your child, it wouldn't have been thought of as unusual or different.
That's right, and I think it was Edward's mother that had Sheila's photograph taken for her 21st birthday.
Yes, no, it's actually as a small child. She was about Sheila was about 10, and she remembered being asked to go to the photographer after school to have a photograph taken, and it was for Edward's mother, so in actual fact her grandmother, who had asked for a photo of her to be sent to the Philippines. And of course now we knew why, and I actually still have that photo. Again, I found that before she died, and she identified it as a photo that she was sent to photographers after school for. And Edward's mother was the second of the parents to die, and in her will was a substantial legacy for Sheila that in actual fact enabled her to buy the very large, comfortable home that they subsequently brought the three of us up in. So she obviously recognised that Sheila needed some help. Well, as her grandchild, they paid Sheila's private school fees as a small child to the local private day school. They provided a lot of financial help without ever admitting that
Quite
they were the
what they were
grandparents.
doing it for, yeah, funny.